Thank you for joining the second in a series of offshore wind educational events hosted by Uniting the Central Coast for Action, a program of the San Luis Obispo Climate Coalition. These events are focused on informing and inspiring local clean energy development and resilience. The recording of the first event is available via our website, slowclimatecoalition.org, or you can find it on the Slow Climate Coalition YouTube channel. I am David, a member of the Slow Climate Coalition team, and I will be your moderator for today. My teammates and I are excited to bring you today's event, the second in a series of three. Today, we'll feature the approval process and public input opportunities for offshore wind in California. The third event is on the 30th of October, and it will focus on presenting facts and figures about the impacts of offshore wind. Now, before we start, we're going to hear from our presenters first, then have a Q&A session at the end. During the presentations, please enter your questions for our speakers into the Q&A feature in Zoom. In the final segment, I will direct those questions to one or more of our speakers. Note, we will only be fielding questions about today's presentations. If we can't get to all the questions today, we will seek to answer any remaining in writing afterwards. The Slow Climate Coalition deeply appreciates the support of our partner organizations, which helped promote this webinar. We continue to work with our partners and with you and our audience to further the transition to clean energy and develop resilience in our communities. Now, today we have three subject matter experts on the process of permitting, environmental reviews, and the oversight of offshore wind energy projects. The first two are from the California Energy Commission, or CEC, which has developed a strategic plan for floating offshore wind energy in federal waters off California's coasts and engages in a range of initiatives, including public input, to enable the deployment of offshore wind responsibly. Our third speaker is from the U.S. Department of Interior's Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM for a handy acronym, which grants leases and rights-of-way for offshore wind energy projects and is the federal oversight authority on 5 existing leases off California. So from the CEC, we will hear from Katerina Robinson, Chief of Staff for the CEC Chairman. In addition to her time at the CEC, Katerina has been a legislative director for over a decade for senators and assembly members in the California State Legislature. She also has a master's in public policy from CSU Sacramento and a bachelor's in political science from UC Berkeley. Also from the CEC, we will hear from Elizabeth Huber, the Director of Siting, Transmission, and Environmental Protection. In addition to her over 10 years at the CEC, Elizabeth has been a Director of Policy, Legislative, and Regulatory Affairs in the recycling and waste management industry. Elizabeth has a Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry from UC Davis. Again, as a reminder, please be sure to post your questions in the Q&A feature here in Zoom, and please focus those questions on what the speakers are covering today. Kat, Elizabeth, you have the floor.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And thank you for hosting this wonderful educational event. We're happy to participate on behalf of the California Energy Commission. I'm going to be sharing my slides and getting them into presentation mode for you here. But my role at the beginning of this presentation is to set the stage and the context for offshore wind development in California. And that context is California's clean energy outlook. I'm Katerina Robinson. I am the Chief of Staff to the Chair of the California Energy Commission. These are my bosses. We have 5 appointed commissioners that are all appointed by the governor to serve and help lead the state to a California clean energy future. And our role really is to promote clean, affordable, and reliable energy supply for all Californians, and to make sure that we are helping to advance California's climate and energy goals throughout the state. So just a little context setting of why we have climate and clean energy goals in California. We are seeing the impacts of climate change every day in this state and in this nation and across the world. At the top here, we just have some statistics on acres burned from 2016 to 2019, 3.7 million acres. And then in a single year in 2020, we exceeded that 4.2 million acres burned, and people's homes and lives are lost in these wildfire incidents, and the wildfire smoke is harmful to all of our human health. Um, I've also included here a photo of the destruction caused by atmospheric rivers on the coast. We continue to see the effects of sea level rise throughout California, and impacts of both drought and flood. And then tonight we're going to see the single strongest storm in decades hit the United States, strongest storm to ever have hit Florida. And these are just continued reminders that what we do today to help stave off the impacts of climate change will help save lives and save our children's lives, and keep a bright future for Californians for years to come. So in response to the concerns of climate change, California has been taking action for decades. Since 2022, when we first passed our initial renewable portfolio standards in the legislature, we have been ratcheting up the goals for which we want to get to all of our energy served by clean energy. Until we got to the most recent legislation in 2018, where we passed a law, SB 100, which requires us to get to 100% clean energy by 2045. And then ultimately in 2022, we've also now passed AB 1279, which says the state needs to be at net zero GHG emissions by 2045. So all those are lining up at 2045. And this document, the 2022 scoping plan put out by the California Air Resources Board, says that the central element to meeting these climate goals is electrification of as many end uses as possible, and then continuing to green those electrons. We're making good progress on that goal. Today, we're at about 61% clean energy on the grid, but we know we need to get to 100% by 2045, and we know that the pie is going to grow because we're electrifying end uses. So our most recent modeling shows that to meet that 2045 goal, the Energy Commission expects that we will need an additional 148,000 megawatts, which is about 5 times more clean energy than we had on the grid in 2022. And it means that we're going to have to increase substantially our build rates of these clean energy resources, that solar and wind will need to increase in build rates by 3 times and batteries by 8 times. And it's also going to mean a lot of land use needs. So if we were, to think about all of this going on the land of California, it's our last modeling from 2022 shows that it's going to be about 1.4 million acres of land needed to accommodate all of the clean energy we need to get on the grid. However, if we can move some of that clean energy off of the lands and into the ocean, we will of course still have impacts, but it frees some of the land impacts and moves some of the impacts out to the ocean. So we're considering impacts and trade-offs of all of these clean energy resources, but I think it's important to understand the context and the scale for which we need to scale up clean energy to meet our goals and stop climate change. So the good news is, some other good news is we are seeing build rates increase to the levels that are needed in order to meet these goals. This last year was the first year that we saw clean energy coming on the grid in the timeframes we need to meet those 3x and 8x building goals. We saw about 6 gigawatts come online this year. We may even get up to closer to 10 by the end of the calendar year. And that's after some stalls from COVID and supply chain issues associated with that. So that's good. And nowhere is this more evident than in battery storage, where we have seen 10 gigawatts of new power come online just since 2019, and much of that was in 2024. And it's also beneficial that a lot of the battery plants have come on in the more recent years, where we have had better standards for those large-scale battery storage projects that helps ensure that there are not going to be fires like we've seen on some of the older battery energy storage systems in the last year or so. So 95% of US capacity that's coming online is green, which is great news. And nearly all of the retirements that are coming off the grid are fossil. So as we are able to load more green resources onto the grid, we are unloading these fossil resources in communities across California and across the United States. And we're doing all of this while we're maintaining a high GDP in California and while population continues to grow. So this is not to the detriment of our economy, but rather is bolstering our economy and bringing new jobs and new economic growth to this state while we're taking down GHG emissions. And then lastly, I'll just close by saying we know that there is more work to be done, even than we know we have to do right now, because we are working on electrifying as many end uses as possible. The load that we're going to need to build clean energy to meet is going to be growing. In 2020, Newsom signed the goals to move to 100% light duty zero emission vehicles sales by 2035, and medium and heavy duty by 2045. And we have seen an explosion of ZEV purchases, and are now at over a quarter of new vehicles sold every quarter in California being zero emission. The top 3 selling cars in California are ZEVs. And we hit the peak of gasoline consumption pre-COVID. You'll see there's a big downturn over COVID, but then it never recovered. So we have hit peak petroleum sales in California, and we are electrifying transportation, and that trend will continue. And we're also working on electrifying our homes. So California Energy Commission is investing nearly $1 billion of state funds in equitable building decarb and federal funds. And we've just launched new programs yesterday on building electrification for residents to put heat pumps and more electric appliances to swap out their gas appliances in their homes. So that's all going to be adding to load as well. And lastly, climate change is making it harder to fight climate change. So this graph shows you what we've traditionally planned for energy to meet energy needs is in the blue bars. And now, because of climate change, we're having to add to that stack to have additional energy available in case of droughts, when our hydroelectric capacity is lower and we don't have energy from our dams, and in case of fires that can take out transmission and leave local areas really constrained, and to cover higher and higher heating and cooling loads in the winters and the summers as our climate changes in California and people adapt and get air conditioners where they didn't used to have them and heaters where they didn't used to have them. So in closing, here's some just photos of some of the projects we do have in California. We have the world's largest thin film solar PV project. You can see it takes up a lot of land. So looking out to the ocean is beneficial for a lot of reasons. This is a large geothermal project, largest in the world. That's also in California. Largest battery energy storage project also in California. And now I'll turn it to Elizabeth Huber, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about our offshore wind goals in California, how our planning processes have been set up so far to develop a strategic plan for the state, and more opportunities for the public to weigh in on this development. Thank you.
Thank you, Kat. And I believe you all have my slides and are going to share them. I don't know, Susan, or do you need us to share them?
We were planning on you to share them.
Absolutely.
unless you needed us to. But John has them, and I'm sure he could share them if you need him to.
If not, if you can, Elizabeth Barminski, if you could raise her to a panelist, she had,
I got it.
you got it?
I got you. Yep.
Oh, thank you.
I will share right now.
I appreciate it. This is the second of 3 presentations I'm doing today. So thank you. Thank you, Kat. And again, it is my pleasure to be here today to talk to you about California's strategic planning activities around offshore wind and federal waters off our coast. For background, I lead the CEC's Siting Transmission Environmental Protection Division, which we fondly call STEP. And we're responsible for reviewing and preparing environmental reviews and other technical analysis of applications submitted to the CEC by developers seeking a license to develop certain types and sizes of power plants in the state. The STEP division also works on long-range planning for infrastructure, including developing land use information for use in strategic energy infrastructure planning, transmission infrastructure planning, and what I'm going to be emphasizing today for all of you, offshore wind energy planning. So as Kat had indicated, SB 100 does require the CC, the Public Utility Commission, and the Air Resources Board to prepare a joint agency report every 4 years, assessing the additional energy resources and resource build rates needed to achieve 100% clean energy and clean electricity by 2045. The first report came out in March of 21 and found that California will need a significant build out over the next 25 years, and that amount of new infrastructure will likely require developing land and ocean space, and identified 10 gigawatts in its modeling. Next slide. So California has been assessing development of wind energy in ocean waters since 2016. And as part of that, we have worked to assess offshore wind and collaborated with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, as already been defined. So building on that success, the legislature passed and the governor signed Assembly Bill 525, which took effect in January of 2022, so about 2.5 years ago. This law required the CEC to draft a strategic plan and respond to the directive set forth in AB 525 that provides the analytical foundation for outlining recommendations for moving forward with offshore wind energy in California, as well as looking at maximizing the benefits to California's workers, communities, and tribes, while also protecting our coastal and marine ecosystems and tribal and cultural resources. So the strategic plan that was recently adopted is the end result of the work required in 525. Next slide, please. So I wanted to highlight some benefits that were identified by the legislature, and they found and declared that developing a cost-effective floating offshore wind industry, including research into emerging technologies, can help the state's economy. Scaling up California-based manufacturing and training a skilled workforce. They also identify potential benefits around expanding our transmission infrastructure planning processes to include electricity coming from offshore wind. And it supports in-state and a West Coast supply chain development process, and is fostering an economy-wide decarbonization that includes offshore wind energy storage, port expansion, and clean fuel production. However, we also note that none of these benefits matter unless we promote and support energy justice with sustainable and just deployment to minimize impacts to tribal governments, on ocean users and marine wildlife, and benefits to coastal and underserved communities is key. And we want to reduce the impacts on the climate, to our health, and the environment. Next slide, please. So how does this offshore wind work? Well, we capture the forces of the wind in the open sea and convert it to electricity. As you see from this visual, it all starts with the wind turbine. The ocean wind turns the blades around a shaft inside the turbine where energy is generated. That energy travels down hundreds of feet beneath the water surface to cables buried under the seabed, connecting to an offshore substation, and then to a substation on land where the electricity created out at the sea is transmitted to California homes and businesses. Next slide, please. So to ensure that we can permit this and operate in a responsible, safe, and equitable manner, AB 525 required the CEC when developing the strategic plan to focus on at minimum 5 topic areas. These include identifying suitable sea space for wind energy areas in federal waters that are sufficient to accommodate California's offshore wind planning goals. And then the CC was required to provide information and recommendations to improve waterfront facilities and port infrastructure, as well as developing that workforce. We are also required to assess the transmission investment upgrades necessary. And then also, as already mentioned by John in his opening remarks, developing a permitting pathway to license these large offshore wind power plants. And then finally, as already stated, ensuring that the strategic plan includes a chapter that is reflective of the state's priorities as it relates to data collection, analysis methodology, impact identification, and mitigation measures. And also identifying potential impacts, again, to our coastal resources, fisheries, Native American and Indigenous people, national defense, and offering strategies for addressing those potential impacts. Next slide, please. As a starting point for the strategic plan, the CEC began with the development of offshore wind planning goals. And by August of 2022, so only 9 months or 8 months into the law being signed, the development and the recommendation and the approval was 2 to 5 megawatts in the early 2030s and 25,000 megawatts by 2045. And we feel that that's foundational to all the work that we were required to do within our interim reports and our partner agencies, technical and reports and studies. So again, as I just mentioned, the CEC specifically was required to develop interim reports that contributed and informed the strategic plan. And those included a preliminary assessment of the economic benefits of offshore wind as they relate to seaport investments and workforce development, needs and standards, which was adopted in February of 2023, and then describe timeframes and milestones for a coordinated, comprehensive, and efficient permitting process for offshore wind energy facilities and its associated electricity and transmission infrastructure. And that report was adopted in April of 2023. Next slide. So AB 525 also directed the CEC to coordinate and collaborate with specific agencies. And we feel we did more than that. We aligned with our partner agencies in developing the strategic plan. These interagency partners included the State Lands Commission, which is the CEQA lead agency for the environmental review and permitting of these floating power plants. The Ocean Protection Council, which leads all environmental monitoring around these facilities. The California Coastal Commission, who executes the coastal planning and regulatory activities for the Federal Coastal Zone Management Act, as well as the state's Coastal Act. The Department of Fish and Wildlife, who, among other provisions, implements the California Threatened and Endangered Species Impacts and Mitigation requirements. And we also consulted with the California Public Utilities Commission, the California Independent System Operator, for offshore wind transmission infrastructure planning and technology development. And then with regards to the needs and standards for developing California's offshore wind workforce, we consulted with California's Labor and Workforce Development Agency and the Workforce Development Board. So as you can see, we have a lot of partners at the state level working in a coordinated effort on the successful deployment of offshore wind in the state. Next slide, please. So another component of our work to get to our strategic plan and the recommendations that came out of it was outreach and our public process. The CEC, aligned with our partner agencies, held more than 200 meetings, more than a dozen workshops, and multiple in-person and virtual meetings. These included communications with more than 30 tribal governments through tribal consultations, intergovernmental roundtables, listening sessions, and 15 tribes continue to participate in an ongoing biweekly offshore wind tribal working group representative of our offshore wind leases on the North Coast and in the Central Coast. Next slide, please. Communications and outreach further included federal working groups with BOEM and another work group with the 5 leaseholders, interagency biweekly and monthly working group meetings, multiple community stakeholder specific workshops and meetings, and one-on-one conversations to develop the strategic plan. It's also important to note here that the legislation defines stakeholders. So the term stakeholders defined for the purposes of AB 525 and include but not limited to fishery groups, labor unions, industry, environmental and environmental justice organizations, and other ocean users. We also have been engaged in meetings with local communities and underserved communities, as well as presented multiple times at the state's Disadvantaged Communities Advisory Group, who review clean energy programs and policies to ensure disadvantaged communities benefit from proposed energy, clean energy and pollution reduction programs. Next slide, please. So as a result of all this work of engagement, consultation, interim reports, studies, workshops, resulted in publishing a draft strategic plan in January of this year. And we produced 3 volumes in order to capture everything from the work that has gone into this. So volume 1 is an overview of the actual strategic plan main report. Volume 2 is that main report, which is a comprehensive strategic plan. And then volume 3 we thought was important because it provides all the technical appendices, as well as all the docketed feedback, communication, comments, and recommendation, and additional resources that were provided to us through that process. So the main report, volume 2, addresses the AB 525 required chapters, as well as additional chapters on the history of offshore wind development, floating offshore wind technologies in the industry, and sections on impacts and strategies to mitigate those impacts to underserved communities. Next slide. So again, this slide just highlights the 11 chapters within AB 525, with those highlighted in blue, again, legislatively mandated. Next slide, please. So public comment received. It's important to highlight that here, especially as we get into talking about the permitting recommendations and transmission infrastructure. The CEC received numerous public comments recommendations, and those include more than 500 pages of written comments, as well as verbal comments from our public workshops. And we held 2 on March 20th and March 29th of 2024, specific to this proposed strategic plan. And that, again, is found on our website. So most parties expressed appreciation for the comprehensive and detailed analysis and discussion presented in these 3 strategic plan volumes. Several environmental organizations and other stakeholders commented that offshore wind represents a promising opportunity to simultaneously address climate change and stimulate economic growth. Some tribes, however, and local community members and representatives from the fishing industry did express outright opposition to offshore wind. Additionally, tribal, local governments, fisheries, and environmental justice groups raised concerns at potential industrialization of California's coast. unknown impacts from all those projects, ports and manufacturing development, and along with the rapid pace of proposed offshore wind development. And they wanted to ensure that the strategic plan highlighted the protection of coastal, biological, and tribal resources. Many parties called out the importance of port development, knowing the critical role of staging and integration sites to the success of the offshore wind industry. Certain commenters raised concerns about potential impacts to those port development, including the implications to environmental justice communities and air quality. They emphasized that offshore wind development must benefit underserved and tribal communities by ensuring local employment opportunities, community benefits, investments in clean energy, and energy reliability improvements. Several parties encouraged an expeditious joint agency planning and coordination of transmission to facilitate the timely development of that infrastructure. And they also noted the importance for the coordinated and comprehensive permitting framework and called for more specificity regarding agency responsibility, timeframes, and milestones in the final strategic plan. And more of that, and more of the other topics on public comment is presented in the volumes of the strategic plan. Next slide, please. So recommendations, chapter 11 in both volume 1 or 2 highlight the recommendations that came out of all the work and the summaries of all the chapters as required. And those were included with the following. So I want to highlight a few of those that do impact, the permitting of these floating power plants as well as the transmission infrastructure. So it's critical recommendations around specific marine impacts. We want to promote a comprehensive environmental research and monitoring that uses best available science and monitoring technology, traditional ecological knowledge, and baseline and long-term monitoring to guide project siting, assess project level, and cumulative impacts during construction and ongoing operations. Specific to tribal impacts, the state should support tribal capacity through technical assistance, including informational working group spaces and webinars. And specific to fishery impacts, the latest commercial, recreational, and cultural fishing data should be used to conduct analyses, assessing spatial and temporal trends in fishing efforts, and value metrics to the offshore wind and nearshore environments, and including consultation with tribes and along with the California Offshore Wind Fisheries Working Group. Specific to underserved frontline communities, offshore wind development and operations should avoid, minimize, or mitigate impacts to these communities, including those and around ports, and support actions to protect already overburdened communities, especially from air and water pollution burdens, and strongly consider mitigations to avoid those. And then specific to the U.S. Department of Defense, the state should continue to coordinate with the Department of Defense Office of the Secretary of Defense Siting Clearinghouse throughout the planning, design, permitting, construction, and decommissioning processes, with an emphasis on early coordination to prevent offshore wind development from encroaching on military testing, training, and operation areas. Further recommendation examples from Chapter 11 are encouraging the identification of suitable sea space in a way that prioritizes least conflict ocean areas, and participate in suitable sea space identification, research, analysis, and refinement of that analysis in coordination with BOEM, the U.S. Coastal Guard, the Department of Defense, to inform the feasibility of offshore wind development that minimizes impacts on California's coast and ocean resources. And then specific to port infrastructure needs, identify federal funding opportunities, tax credits, and other resources in the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, and other structures for modernization and expansion of our ports, and support inclusion of local content and prevailing wage in port projects. And then specific to our workforce development, to help California develop an equitable, skilled, and trained workforce to support the offshore wind industry. Specific to offshore wind permitting, our recommendation is to develop and implement a coordinated permitting for offshore wind and related projects based on a previously successful Renewable Energy Action Team, or REAT approach, and a Renewable Energy Policy Group model. Next slide, please. AB 525 directed the CEC, again in coordination with our state agencies, for identification of sea space in 2 phases. First, we identified the sea space established by BOEM in its 2018 call for nominations and any other relevant information necessary to achieve our offshore wind planning goals of the 2 to 5 gigawatts by 2030. And then second, identify suitable sea space for future development of offshore wind to accommodate the 2045 offshore wind planning goals of 25 gigawatts. And then finally is this graphic on this slide shows the potential sea space for both current and future projects. AB 525 also directed the CEC to identify suitable sea space, when identifying suitable sea space, to consider existing data and information on offshore wind resource potential and commercial viability, along with the existing and necessary transmission and port infrastructure, while protecting and conserving our tribal, cultural, and biological resources, with the goal of prioritizing least conflict ocean areas. In addition, AB 525 requires the CEC to incorporate the information developed by BOEM's California Intergovernmental Renewable Energy Task Force and from the California Offshore Wind Energy Gateway. Next and final slide. So as already mentioned, we are implementing AB 209, a complement to 525, specific to offshore wind ports and waterfront facilities improvement grant program. It's a $45 million grant solicitation with 2 categories: those that are in the preliminary stages of port assessment, and then category 2 is for those that are at a advanced stage in the development of their port enhancements or expansions to support offshore wind industry. We are also advancing further reports and strategies related to ports, supply chain, and workforce development as directed to us in Assembly Bill 3 that was passed in 2023. And then we also continue to partner with our research and development division on technology development around transmission infrastructure. And then again, finally, we continue our discussions with tribal governments, underserved communities, fisheries, additional stakeholders, our federal, state, and local agency partners. And we continue to advance and explore and modify the recommendations and strategies developed in the AB 525 strategic plan that was adopted on July 10th of this year. So as you can see, a lot of work yet to get done in the successful deployment of offshore wind in the 2030s. So with that, I conclude my presentation and thank Kat for her help today and moving those slides along.
Thank you both very much for everything you just covered today. For everyone, we are now going to hear from Emily Hildreth. She's the acting Renewable Energy Section Chief for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's Pacific Region. Emily joined BOEM's Office of Renewable Energy Programs back in 2018, working most recently as a policy analyst focused on offshore wind permitting and rulemaking. Emily has a JD from the George Washington University Law School and a BA in International Studies and Political Science from UCSD. Again, just a reminder, be sure to post your questions here in the Q&A feature, and please focus those on what the speakers are covering today. Emily, you have the floor.
Thank you. Just getting set up here. All right. That view working okay?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much. Hi, my name is Emily Hildreth, and I work for BOEM. And I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to join us here today, or to watch this if you are watching it as a recording. Offshore wind and its permitting processes are very complex, and I applaud you for taking the time to learn about all the different things that are involved now. And I hope that you will have a better understanding by the end of my presentation. This is what I plan to go over today, just who my agency is and where we have authority, the current status of the 5 leases off of California, some information about a programmatic environmental impact statement that's being done under NEPA, because that will actually be available for public comment quite soon. And then I will spend the remainder of my time talking about the main permit for offshore wind farms, which is the construction and operations plan. So I will go through what the contents of those plans are, how there are many parallel federal processes involved, as well as the additional project-specific environmental review and consultations that occur during review of those plans. And then finally, I will talk a bit about what the decision that can be made is at the end. I also have a video that I'm not going to take the time to show today, but I encourage you all to check out. If you do BOEM renewable energy in Google and Whiteboard, you can find it, and it has a nice overview of all the different parts of what BOEM does related to offshore wind. So who are we? Our mission is to manage the development of the outer continental shelf in an environmentally and economically responsible way. So we do have a dual mission of both environmental conservation and economic development. In addition, I wanted to highlight that we are one of 11 bureaus in the US Department of the Interior. So we have sister bureaus that you might be more familiar with than us, like the National Park Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service, both of whom we often work with on offshore wind issues. In addition, we have another sister bureau called the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement that has a very important role in offshore wind, particularly once a project is constructed, because they oversee the compliance and enforcement and inspections of those wind farms. I also wanted to talk about the where in terms of where BOEM's work takes place. So as I mentioned, our jurisdiction is limited to the outer continental shelf. In the Pacific, that extends from 3 to 200 nautical miles off the coast of California, Oregon, Washington, Hawaii, and recently we gained authority also in the Pacific territories. And you can see if you look at the black bold line here, that's actually quite a large area. So that's the entire extent of the outer continental shelf. And it's really like an additional California or Oregon added out beyond the extent of the terrestrial United States. I also wanted to emphasize that we actually do not have authority to authorize offshore wind or any other renewable energy offshore in national marine sanctuaries, national monuments, national wildlife refuges, and national parks. So the areas you see in the red hatch on this map are areas where we could not authorize those activities by law. Zooming in a bit on the existing California leases, there are 5 of them, and you can see them here. And they are preparing for future submissions of the permit that I'll be discussing in more detail later, the Construction and Operations Plan, which we call COP for short. But right now they are engaging in certain activities. They are conducting surveys, geotechnical surveys, which include actual contact with the seabed, geophysical surveys, benthic surveys to look at what habitat is on the seabed, as well as a large number of biological surveys, such as avian and marine mammal. And then they are also conducting very detailed archaeological surveys offshore. In addition, the lessees do plan to deploy meteorological and mid-ocean buoys, which collect data about the wind resource as well as beneath the water, so currents, temperature, seasonal fluctuations, and other information like that. And they're doing all of those activities because they need a lot of detailed information in order to complete the permitting process and to design their project. Now, while they're doing those activities, BOEM does have an ongoing role. Before they do any survey, they have to submit a survey plan to BOEM, which we review for compliance with their lease requirements. In addition, their leases include communication plan requirements that are focused on some specific stakeholders, most notably federally recognized tribes, fisheries, and other agencies. And then finally, these lessees submit progress reports to BOEM every 6 months with summaries of their activities, both in terms of what they're doing on the water and also in terms of their engagement. And those are made public online. This fairly complicated diagram shows everything that's involved in offshore wind from BOEM's perspective, from the early identification of leases all the way through the construction of a project and its eventual decommissioning. However, I want to focus on the 2 areas highlighted in red text because that's where we are again with the California leases. And I also noted here that there's an ongoing California offshore wind programmatic EIS, which I want to bring to your attention because of an upcoming public comment period. Before I talk about when that is, I did want to explain what is a programmatic environmental impact statement versus a project-specific environmental impact statement. Because for the wind farms in those 5 leases, there are going to be these 2 documents. The programmatic document is focused on similar actions that we assume will take place in all of the leases, and it's across that whole region of the 5 leases and the surrounding waters. And it includes a high-level analysis of potential impacts and existing resources that could be impacted by those actions. And the focus of this programmatic EIS in California is on mitigation measures that could be applied to those actions. In addition, in the future, there will be project-specific environmental impact statements under NEPA for each project that is proposed by a developer. And what you could expect for those is that they would incorporate some of the analysis from the programmatic EIS by reference, and then they will focus much more on site-specific impacts from a particular project. So if there's any unique resources or protected resources that happen to be in the area of that project, they will be more focused on that. In addition, it'll be more targeted towards the precise design of the project. So what kind of anchors will they use? Where will their cables go? How many turbines are they proposing? What height are those turbines? And other aspects like that. And then finally, the EIS provides another opportunity to include additional mitigation measures that are more targeted towards those site-specific issues. As I mentioned, there will be an upcoming comment period on the programmatic EIS that I thought would be of interest to you all. I don't have an exact date, but it looks like the draft programmatic EIS comment period will be between November and February, and it is going to be a 90-day public comment period. So I encourage you to stay tuned to that. After this preliminary period is over, the developer is going to take all of that information that they gathered during their surveys and mid-ocean buoy campaign, and they're going to draft their COP and they're going to submit it to BOEM. And this is when the permitting process really begins from the federal perspective. We call this the COP review period under the lease, and it lasts a little over 2 years. So this is when you really see what the proposal is from the developer for a specific wind farm. And I want to talk a little bit more about what the scope of that permit as well as the EIS that will accompany it is. So the construction operation plan will include a description of the turbines, the inter-array cables, the mooring lines. There will typically be one or more substations offshore as well, and then an export cable to shore. Now, that export cable typically goes in state waters and then on land where there's state and local government jurisdiction. Even though BOEM's jurisdiction is limited to the outer continental shelf, the construction and operations plan by law has to describe the entire picture, the entire project. In addition, we do partner with a number of agencies, both at the state and federal level, to look at all of the impacts across this entire picture. Now I want to give you a bit more of a sense of what actually reading a construction operations plan would look like. And I do apologize because there's a lot here. These documents are hundreds and hundreds of pages long, but I guess what I'm hoping is that you will see it is also quite comprehensive. So it starts with project information, typically in volume 1, and that includes project siting. So where is the project proposed? Is it the entire lease area or only a portion? Where will the cables go? Is there only one route being considered or more than one route being considered? How far apart will the turbines be? There's also a project design envelope. So that describes what types of turbines are being considered, what types of foundations they will be on, what type of transmission technology would be used. Is it AC or DC or both options? It includes potential cable routes, and also can include more than one point of interconnection depending on the specific project. In addition, this section also looks at all the different activities that occur during project construction, operations, and maintenance, as well as conceptual decommissioning, which is conceptual because it will occur about 30 years later after the project is constructed. And there's actually a separate permitting process for that decommissioning. The second category of information is seafloor survey results. So as I mentioned, several of the lessees are actually engaging in surveys right now. One of the major reports that they provide is called the Marine Site Investigation Report. This includes a combination of their geophysical and geotechnical data synthesized together. And it includes a number of subcategories, but two of the main ones are geohazards, as well as a comprehensive ground model, essentially of what the seabed looks like, both on its surface and below. They also provide comprehensive benthic reports that look at what kind of ecosystems there are on the seabed itself. And then finally, they provide a marine archaeological resource assessment. And in this report, that's where you would see things like shipwrecks. The third category of information is safety-related submissions. This includes a safety management system, which describes how the operator will ensure that all of the work done with the wind farm will be conducted in a safe manner, and how they plan to handle any incidents that may occur. A navigational safety risk assessment, which looks at any risks to navigation as well as rescue helicopters, and seeks to manage those risks. And that actual document review is coordinated with the Coast Guard. It also includes a preliminary cable burial risk assessment, which would indicate whether they plan to bury their cables, and if so, how deep. And how deep is determined by what other potential activities could impact those cables, in order to ensure that fishers, other cable users, anchors from vessels can all be done in a safe manner. And there's also an oil spill response plan. The other major component of a construction operations plan is a section that covers the affected environment, potential impacts, and proposed mitigations. So while BOEM conducts an independent environmental impact statement, we do use this information to inform that statement, as well as to help us focus on certain areas to do some independent analysis on. And in addition, this section allows the developer to propose mitigations that they want to proactively commit to, that BOEM would then require if we approve their project. So this section will look at biological resources, physical resources, which would include oceanography, water quality, air quality, the acoustic environment, which is important for several species in the marine environment, cultural resources, which includes archaeological resources, both in the water and on land, where the cable route is and where the substation is if there's new construction that has to occur, any impacts to historical properties, as well as visual resources. And there's also socioeconomic resources. So that would include fisheries, marine transportation and navigation, national security, environmental justice, and onshore communities and economies. The fifth category of information are engineering related submissions. This includes the project verification strategy, which involves a certified verification agent who will be involved in reviewing the manufacturing and installation of all the components of the wind farm, and a hierarchy of industry standards. Since offshore wind is quite active worldwide, a lot of these projects use standards that are US based, but also international. And this is where they indicate which standards they are planning to adhere to for BOEM's review and potential agreement with or disagreement with. And there are conceptual designs for all the different components that they are proposing in their facility. And then finally, there's a couple of extra items I wanted to mention, which is the consistency certification under the Coastal Zone Management Act and final financial assurance to cover any costs of decommissioning should the developer become bankrupt or some other situation like that were to arise at the end of life for the project. So that's BOEM's permit. And BOEM is the lead federal agency for permitting offshore wind. But that does not mean we're the only agency involved. There's actually quite a number of permits that have to be obtained from other federal agencies, including the Corps of Engineers, the National Marine Fisheries Service, and the Environmental Protection Agency. At the same time, a number of consultations are also required under the Endangered Species Act for essential fish habitat and under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. And all of this is occurring in approximately a 2-year time period. And you can see how fun that looks with the chart on the side there. That's an example from an actual offshore wind farm. So focusing in a bit more on that project-specific environmental review process. This provides a timeline, and then I've highlighted in the 2 boxes 2 public comment periods that I think you should be aware of as a project actually gets proposed. So there is a public scoping period that takes place a short time after BOEM receives the COP submission and decides to move forward with an environmental impact statement. This is a really important time to engage, to identify, particularly if there are alternatives related to the design of the project that the government should be considering, as well as potential impacts that should be considered as part of the environmental impact statement. In addition, there's a public comment period that accompanies the draft environmental impact statement. By the time you get to the record of decision, that is when you get to BOEM's decision whether to approve the construction operations plan or not, which looks like this. Typically, if we approve, we would approve the plan with conditions. And these can be dozens to hundreds of conditions, which are essentially requirements to ensure that that wind farm is operated in a way that is safe and minimizes impacts to the environment. Now, if the construction operation plan is approved, there are actually a couple more steps that have to occur before construction would begin. The lessee actually has to also submit a facility design report and fabrication and installation report to our sister agency, BSEE, before they could start installation. And that third-party certified verification agent I mentioned before, they're also involved in this process. Assuming BSEE does not object to those reports and all other federal permits and state permits are secured, then the lessee may begin construction and operation of their planned facility. And that's really where I plan to stop today. I did have a video that really puts this permitting process into a larger context for BOEM, but I think we're a little bit short on time, so I'm just going to encourage you to find that on your own, and I think we'll do our best to provide the link to folks who attended. And with that, this is my contact information. And BOEM really values stakeholder engagement, so I encourage you to reach out to us. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Emily. Okay, so we're going to transition into our Q&A section. I just want to reiterate or post or say this caveat to all the questions that have come in, that if any are overlapping, we've tried to combine them, and therefore you may not hear word for word. And then there were some questions that I think are interesting for sure. For example, why did the governor veto something, that are just out of the scope for today's presenters? That's a good question to pose to the governor's office, of course. So again, we're going to focus on our questions that we're going to field, on those that are about the offshore wind development process, public input, and timeline. Note that part 3, our third event, is going to be on the 3rd of October, which you'll be able to register for by next week. And that's going to talk or go over facts and figures about the impact of offshore wind that might include but not be limited to fishing and marine acoustics, ports, cost analysis, etc. So that's those kind of questions we're going to have you hold off. We're going to hold off on and have you perhaps repost those on the 30th of October. All right, so first, and Emily, you did a really great job of summarizing, and wouldn't mind hearing how one can keep posted about the exact dates for all those public input opportunities. Is there a, is there a notification list, a website that's always URL to go to that would quickly inform us when those dates get solidified? And mechanically, how does it happen? Is it only written, or are there other ways?
Yeah, there's a couple of things you can do. I mean, there is a California specific BOEM website. I think that's boem.gov/California. And there would be information provided as soon as any public comment period opens. We do also post about that on social media, so another option is to follow us. But we do also have listservs, and if you sign up for that, you can select so that you get targeted information, not just every different kind of release that BOEM has. I do need to go find, there's a link where you need to go sign up for that, and I don't have it on the tip of my tongue, so that's something I can look for. But yeah, we definitely try and make folks aware. We also do Federal Register notifications for all those official comment periods. But that's not necessarily the most accessible forum.
Great, thank you. And we will, for the audience's benefit, we will eventually give us all volunteer effort here. Give us a week or two. We will get all the Q&A together and include those links that you just mentioned, Emily. So that same question about resummarizing the public input opportunities, both mechanically and roughly when, if that can be summarized from the CEC as well. Elizabeth, Katerina.
I'm happy to jump in and answer that question. We do have a what we call a listserv, where we specific to AB 525 offshore wind activities, and so we are posting all and any related information to that site. And so there's 2 ways that you can join: is signing up to receive information that's posted to that docket, and then also to our listserv. And I'm happy to send that on to you, that you can share with your membership and participants today on how they can sign up for our offshore wind listserv, so that they would get notices or notification when we actually brought the strategic plan to a business meeting. But we have 2 interim reports, as I just mentioned, that we'll be doing around supply chain and workforce. So if you join on that, if you join that listserv, it will provide all that information, as well as the current AB 209, ports and waterfront facility infrastructure grants that is open for solicitation as we speak right now. So we'll drop that into the chat as well, John.
Fantastic. All right, so before getting too much further, do a quick clarification, definitional, if you will, on the difference between clean energy and renewable energy. And that question's for the CEC.
Yeah,
like to
good
chime in.
question. It's a statutorily defined set of terms. So renewable energy for the purposes of the renewable portfolio standard did not include hydroelectric power. And that was partially because California has typically had a lot of hydroelectric power, which made the California grid much cleaner than other states' grids in California. And early legislatures did not want to include hydroelectric power as part of its renewable resources. We wanted to build more renewable resources, like solar and wind. In our renewable portfolio standards definition, it also includes power that's created from biogas from clean sources like excess landfill gas um, and manure from dairy digesters. So there's a couple things like that that are smaller percentages. But in California, most of the renewable power that is being used is either solar, and that could be large scale solar projects like in the desert, or rooftop solar projects in a community or on your home, and then wind projects and battery storage for those solar and wind projects is by far the largest. Offshore wind would come in and be probably the third largest, and then there's some smaller like biomass and biogas resources that also count as renewable in California. Elizabeth, did you want to add anything else to that?
Yeah, I just want to thank you, Kat. Yeah, just, reemphasize what Kat said. Large hydro is not on our renewable portfolio standard that was adopted in 2002 because of, at one point we had 75 to 90% of our electricity in Northern California was coming from large hydro. Nuclear, as indicated, is also not on the RPS, but when we do look at overall clean and renewable in the state, it goes higher than just RPS because that's how we identify the nuclear, the battery storage, and the large hydro. I do want to emphasize that this is unique to the state of California. There are, I believe, 32 other states that have an RPS, program, and their goals do include nuclear and large hydro. So you need to look at each state specifically as to what is defined as renewable for them, and what's defined as clean. So just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, so just to clarify, the renewable does not include nuclear and large hydro and storage. But when you get to clean resources, which is the number I put up of 61% of our resources are now clean resources, that includes hydro, nuclear, and battery storage.
Great, thank you. Perhaps with both of you still having the floor, a good natural segue to be in some other questions that kind of hit around the following question, and that is, how is that, and I think you showed a Cal ISO portfolio, I think this is Elizabeth that you did. How is that breakout, percentages, how is that determined in terms of what's ideal, right? So what's optimal in terms of the mix that you showed earlier? How is that determined?
Yeah, I can start, and I'll see if I can find that slide that I can bring back up for people to look at while we talk.
Okay.
But the short answer is we go through modeling exercises, and this was part of the SB 100 process, and modeling. I might have to do it this way. That the California Energy Commission and the California Public Utilities Commission and California Independent System Operators conducted to figure out what was the ideal mix of resources to get us to 100% clean energy. And we consider things in those models like reliability, least cost. Increasingly, we're having to look at meeting energy at different slices of the day because, of course, there's that really important segment when solar is going down and we don't have onshore wind resources quite yet. And we really need energy in those evening hours because people are turning on their TVs and washing machines and and all their appliances at home when they're coming home from work. So meeting those hourly needs is really important too. And we put those all in models, and we model several different sensitivities. And the CEC is actually in the process with our sister agencies of re-upping those models. Now we're going through the next iteration of the SB 100 planning process. And so we will probably have revised numbers and some different scenarios and options to getting to 100% as well, that will be coming out of that modeling exercise in the next year. But this first model that was run in 2021 was really, is it achievable for us to get to 100% renewable by 2045? And what would it look like in order to meet reliable and clean and affordable energy with 100% clean?
Great, thank you. One of the follow-up questions, I think you might have at least answered in part, was why is offshore wind specifically an important choice to have in that portfolio? I think one of them was, of course, the time of day, or maybe mostly time of night, that the bulk of that energy gets produced, or any other things that make offshore wind attractive to California's energy portfolio.
Yeah, I will just give a really quick answer and let Elizabeth answer, but we did model during the last energy crisis when we were really tight on energy, not this summer, but 2 summers ago now. How would offshore wind resources in those two areas of the state be functioning or showing up on the grid? And we have found that those lease areas produce power exactly when we need them during those shoulder times. They actually produce more similar to a base load resource, like a natural gas facility that just runs all the time. The wind just keeps coming off the ocean. So it allows us to retire a fossil plant much more effectively than solar and wind resources that are onshore that tend to peak at different times, but then kind of be off at other times. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I just want to add to that. It's all of the above, like Kat said, and what everyone shared in their presentations today. But we also look at offshore wind potentially as a statewide supply source of renewable energy. So when we're looking at system-wide facilities like Diablo Canyon, which produces over 2.3 gigawatts annually, for system reliability, you're having to find ways to offset it. And there is as we have identified, even with the 50% of our sea space is suitable for offshore wind, because as Emily shared what BOEM, has to do in the outer continental shelf, and protection of, these natural and ocean resources, just narrowing it to 50% of that sea space. I mean, we're looking at least potential of over 28 gigawatts that were identified in our first planning goals report, championed by the chair as our lead commissioner for offshore wind. So that's a huge amount of clean energy that can gap fill those times a day when there isn't substantial solar or onshore wind, as Kat had indicated. So,
and I'll just clarify that we don't plan to use 50% of the ocean space of
No, we
California
don't.
for offshore wind. That's just when we least conflicted out all the areas to just get the, where might it be reasonable to do so? We know we have, 50% of the sea space is still viable, and at least conflict. So we have small areas that we're going with BOEM, obviously, for building out that offshore wind today.
Great, thank you. Going back to the public input process and opportunities question, can you comment of breathe with past examples or how it's going to weight things going forward? How much of that public input actually influences the process? And that's a question to all of you. Sorry. Yeah.
I'll start with it because Kat and Emily both have participated in many of those 200 meetings and workshops and one-on-one sessions that we had, consultations with tribal governments and listening sessions, and they play a huge impact. We learned so much from our stakeholder community, and so we are continuing a fisheries working group. We have the tribal working group. State Lands is championing, our engagement with our frontline community specific to offshore wind, but we continue to partner, we continue to listen. It allows us to look at alternatives in successfully and safely deploying offshore wind energy reliability, with reliability, aspects to it. But we also have learned from our stakeholders where there's, viable infrastructure that we could be utilizing. We were at one community meeting down in Morro Bay where they indicated there's still some oil and gas platforms out there. Can we utilize them? So it's a truly back and forth. Tribal representatives have shared that their knowledge in their in their ocean environmental expertise that they can help support and help educate during all the studies and through the COP process, as Emily indicated. So these engagements and outreach from both sides is very critical, and we do listen and try to work through and mitigate those things. We sometimes say that we all come to the table. We may not like all the decisions made, but we all can leave the table realizing we, compromised, the best we could and feel good about how we compromised. So, and it ensures everybody's part of the process.
Thank you, Emily. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Sure. So when I was working in the Atlantic in my policy role, I ended up working really closely with the teams that have been reviewing the offshore wind farms that have been proposed, and some of which are under construction in the Atlantic. And that was with them on their EISs. And I can tell you, people read every comment. They really do. I've been there. I've been in doing that work. And I also know for BOEM, particularly when it comes to, they approve the project, but approve it with conditions, that can include pretty significant changes to the project from what was proposed. It is like a very rare, and that can mean in sort of NEPA speak for anyone who's familiar with it, selecting an alternative that's not just the proposed action. I don't have stats at my fingertips, but it is the exception where we go with what the developer proposed. And that is because of input we're receiving, whether it's about visual impacts, marine mammals, a different cable route, whatever it is. So I would like to emphasize that it matters and we take it really seriously and it affects our decisions.
Great, thank you. This might be to any one of you. I'm thinking especially the CEC, and that is in doing a cost-benefit analysis, which I think was mentioned as an important input to decisions about what kind of renewable portfolio we want to have built. The non-renewable infrastructure that goes into building those products or the construction thereof. Is that taken into account? How is that done? Life cycle analysis, question mark. I wonder if I could open that up to any of you ultimately, but starting with the CEC.
I'll happy to take that one as well. So
Okay.
There, it is recommendations and some level setting and layering on recommendations on doing this cost analyses, and so those are so you'll find in the chapters. I don't, unless my team wants to jump in. I know Eli and Lizzie are on the call, but there are some, we did identify some cost benefits to offshore wind, bringing, skilled labor in. I mean, we're talking between the 5 projects, close to, 300 employees just for the construction and development. And then you start building on that for tier 2, tier 3 supply chain, the port infrastructure. So there is a cost life cycle analysis that's been done in the study, with some recommendations of more studies that we need to consider doing, because there's also a huge part of the investment. And then there's also the component of the environmental life cycle. What is that going to do to the undersea, life, the coastline, plant and animal life. And so we made recommendations around environmental monitoring and studying these life cycles. And the Ocean Protection Council is the lead on that. And they have just formed or in the process of forming this environmental monitoring working group that brings together both public, private, and academia experts to start looking closer into specific to the West Coast. I'm sure Emily can share what she's learned in the South, what's happened on the East Coast on our study tour back there. But our coastline is completely different than on the East coastline. So we know we have a lot more work to do in the environmental life cycle analysis. I hope that answered both your environmental and cost benefit question.
I was just going to add, because I think I heard a carbon footprint type question potentially in there as well, like the overall carbon footprint of the electrical generation. And I actually just really recommend NREL, the National Renewable Energy Labs. They've actually done a study comparing. And while I support the all of the above approach that's been discussed, this is actually an area where offshore wind really excels. There are very, very few technologies that have as good of a greenhouse gas life cycle as offshore wind. And there's a link that, if we can't share in the chat here, I'll make sure is kind of provided as part of the materials that summarizes that study.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
Next question is for you, Emily. Can you share any lessons learned from the projects that are further along and or have gone online now on the East Coast, and how those are helping inform what we're looking at potentially doing here on the West Coast?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually California is in a great place to be picking up on the lessons learned from the East Coast. For the East Coast, what we were really doing there was picking up on lessons learned by Europe and their system of regulation and oversight in the marine environment. While, there was a lot we could learn from what they had already done, because they'd been doing offshore wind for 20 years before we started, there was still a lot we had to figure out, especially under our legal system and like the different jurisdictions with state and federal. And so I think now, we've worked through BOEM's regulations in a way that they just never been tested. It was like every day we have novel questions. And I think now we are in a really good position where we're going to be able to monitor those projects, and learn a lot from any potential impacts that we didn't expect from them. I think, there are some incidents that are occurring that definitely bring lessons learned as well. Anything that operates in the marine environment, it's kind of always expect the unexpected. I do think we're really prepared to deal with these situations, but I am also confident that California is going to really, really benefit from this first round of projects going all the way through in the Atlantic. And those lessons learned are going to be able to be applied.
And of course, if the CEC would like to comment on this as well, you're free to take the floor. Okay. We are getting towards the end, and there were a couple of other questions having to do with that clean energy versus renewable energy question. So I'm wondering if I could attempt a very layman's non-statutory answer and have you correct me
Sure.
or not or confirm. Uh, clean energy would be something that at the time of generating electricity is not emitting any greenhouse gases, right? Maybe it has something embedded, but certainly at the time of generation of electricity. Whereas renewable energy, which would be a subset of that, arguably is from a source that can naturally replenish itself.
That's a great way of summarizing it. I think long term, and Emily may know better, but at the federal level, I mean, at the end of the day, if it's a non-fossil fuel, it's a clean energy. With the understanding it's limited to zero carbon footprint. And then what you're going to see is states like California that have an RPS. They further define, renewable resources for purposes of their renewable portfolio standard. They clearly define what can get credit as a renewable, right? But these are all, clean, natural resources, as you indicated. So it's a kind of an
Oh, thank you. That was very kind. Thank you.
David, I just want to clarify that one of the folks that answered questions is absolutely right in that it's not always that they don't create any GHG emissions. Biomass, for example, which is 2%, it's a very small percent of California's energy mix. It was 2% in 2023, but that's a combustion resource, so it's creating some GHGs when it's combusted, but the life cycle there is what we're looking at, which is that those resources are otherwise in the forests. They're being pile burned in ag fields, and so you're getting just straight emissions from those resources unless you're putting them through a power plant, which is doing some scrubbing of those emissions. Significant scrubbing is from what they would get in the wild. And then most of our resources are, no GHG emitting, or they take a little electricity to turn on the facility, but then they're running off of a renewable resource.
Great, thank you. Everyone, we've reached the end of our scheduled time. We will address any remaining questions related to today's topics in writing, including some of the links to public input and getting notifications, etc. If your question was best addressed in our next session, and there were a couple, for example, acoustics and other cost-related questions, please plan to join us for the next event, which is on the 30th of October. That's Facts About Offshore Wind. And the registration for that will be available on our website, slowclimatecoalition.org, by next Monday, if not before. So with that, please join me in thanking our presenters for their excellent presentations today, our co-marketing sponsors, and the team to put this event together. Thank you all for participating in today's event.